Every empire begins the same way, with ambition, innovation, and wealth beyond measure. And every one of them ends the same way, too. Look at the images that define human achievement. The marble columns of Rome rising toward the heavens, the gaslit streets of Victorian London stretching across a quarter of the globe, the neon skyline of New York piercing the clouds, the digital glow of Shanghai reflecting infinite possibility. These are the monuments we build when we believe we've transcended the limits that bound every generation before us. These are the symbols we erect when we think we've finally discovered the formula for eternal prosperity. But buried inside every boom is the exact same equation that guarantees the bust. It's not a conspiracy. It's not even a mistake. It's a pattern so fundamental to human nature that it operates like gravity, pulling every civilization through the same trajectory, regardless of technology, regardless of ideology, regardless of how sophisticated we believe ourselves to be. This pattern has destroyed empires that commanded legions, dismantled kingdoms that ruled the seas, and it's currently working its mathematics on the economic system that governs your life right now. The pattern is simple, almost elegant in its brutality. First comes production, genuine wealth created through innovation and effort. Then comes the substitution, where symbols of wealth replace actual wealth. Next arrives dependence, where entire populations reorganize around the illusion rather than the foundation. Finally comes the reckoning, where reality reasserts itself with merciless precision. This isn't theory. This isn't speculation. This is the documented autopsy of every dominant civilization in human history. And it's happening again, right now, in ways most people won't recognize until the collapse is already underway. The pattern was born in Rome, though the Romans themselves would never have called it that. They simply thought they had discovered the secret to permanent greatness. In the first centuries of the empire, Rome wasn't just powerful, it was impossibly wealthy. The conquest of new territories brought not just glory, but the actual substance of prosperity. Grain from Egypt, gold from Hispania, slaves to work the land, and tribute flowing in from every corner of the known world. This wasn't paper wealth. This wasn't financial engineering. This was real value extracted from real places and transformed into the greatest concentration of material abundance the world had ever witnessed. The Roman economy at its height functioned like a magnificent machine, with each component reinforcing the others. Farmers produced food, soldiers secured borders, merchants facilitated trade, and the state maintained roads and aqueducts that made the entire system possible. Roman coins carried actual value because they contained actual precious metal. A denarius wasn't just a promise, it was a piece of silver you could weigh in your hand. But prosperity does something to the human mind. It creates the illusion of permanence. When harvests have been good for 3 generations, when the borders have been secure for 100 years, when wealth flows so consistently that it seems inexhaustible, people begin to make a fundamental error in calculation. They start to believe that the abundance is natural rather than constructed, permanent rather than conditional, guaranteed rather than earned. The Roman elite began accumulating wealth on scales that transformed them from citizens into a separate species. Estates sprawled across entire provinces. Private armies protected personal interests. Political power became something you could purchase, rather than something you earned through service. Meanwhile, the common citizens of Rome became increasingly dependent on state provision. The grain dole, which began as emergency relief, transformed into a permanent expectation. Work became optional for large segments of the population. Why labor in the fields when bread came free at the forum? Why learn a trade when entertainment was provided at state expense? This was the moment when Rome made the fatal transition from a civilization that created wealth to one that simply consumed it. And here's where the pattern reveals its most insidious characteristic. The people managing the empire weren't stupid. They could see that expenses were exceeding revenues. They understood that something had to give. But rather than make the hard choices that would have preserved the system, they made the easy choice that would destroy it. They began debasing the currency. In the reign of Nero, the denarius was reduced from 95% silver to 93%. A small change, barely noticeable. But the precedent was set. Over the following centuries, emperors facing budget crises made the same choice again and again. Mix more base metal into the coins. Each emperor told himself it was temporary, just until the crisis passed. Each emperor convinced himself that no one would notice, that confidence would remain intact. By the time of Diocletian, the silver content had fallen below 5%. The denarius, which had once been a store of genuine value, was now a token whose worth existed only in collective belief. And here's the crucial insight that connects Rome to every empire that followed. The collapse didn't announce itself. There was no moment when citizens woke up to find the empire ended. Instead, there was a gradual degradation so slow that each generation adapted to the new normal without realizing how far they had fallen from the old one. The borders became porous. The roads fell into disrepair. The legions that had once been invincible now fought as mercenaries for the highest bidder. The city that had organized the known world became a provincial outpost ruled by whoever commanded the most swords. Rome didn't fall in a day. It sank slowly, drowning in the consequences of substituting symbols for substance, in the mathematical certainty that you cannot consume more than you produce forever, regardless of how cleverly you manipulate the accounting. The British Empire didn't study Roman history as a warning. They studied it as a blueprint, convinced that this time would be different because they possessed something Rome never had: industrial technology and a truly global reach. And for a remarkable span of time, they were right to be confident. Britain, in the 19th century, accomplished something unprecedented in human history. They didn't just conquer territory, they reorganized the planet around British systems. The pound sterling became the language of international commerce. British ships carried goods on every ocean. British capital financed projects on every continent. British legal frameworks governed trade from Hong Kong to Montreal. This wasn't the plunder economy of Rome. This was something more sophisticated, more durable, or so it seemed. The British had discovered how to extract value through systems rather than through direct force. They built railroads in India and took a percentage of everything transported. They established banks in Africa and profited from every transaction. They created a global economic architecture where wealth flowed toward London not through conquest, but through structure. The prosperity this created was staggering. British citizens enjoyed standards of living that would have seemed like fantasy to any previous generation. Technology accelerated at bewildering speed. Medicine advanced. Literacy spread. The middle class expanded to include millions of people who in any prior era would have lived in grinding poverty. Victorian Britain looked at its accomplishments and concluded that they had transcended the limitations that destroyed previous civilizations. They had unlocked permanent progress through the marriage of capitalism, technology, and empire. But the pattern was already at work, invisible to those inside the system. The prosperity created by genuine innovation gradually transformed into prosperity created by financial arrangement. Britain's dominance rested on the pound sterling being as good as gold, literally backed by precious metal reserves. This backing created global confidence. Foreign governments held pounds because they could exchange them for gold at a fixed rate. This confidence allowed Britain to run persistent trade deficits, to import more than it exported, to consume more than it produced, because everyone trusted British currency. The First World War shattered that trust through simple mathematics. Fighting an industrial war across multiple continents required resources that exceeded Britain's capacity to produce. The government faced a choice: stop fighting or abandon the gold standard. They suspended convertibility, promising it was temporary, just until the emergency passed. But the precedent was set. The link between currency and physical value had been severed. After the war, Britain attempted to restore the old system, to return the pound to its pre-war gold parity. This decision, made with the best intentions by the finest economic minds of the era, accelerated Britain's decline. The economy couldn't support the strong pound. Exports became expensive. Industry became uncompetitive. Unemployment spread. And when the next crisis came in the 1930s, the gold standard was abandoned again, this time permanently. The pattern was repeating. Britain, like Rome before it, had transitioned from creating real wealth to managing the symbols of wealth. The empire that had reorganized the planet found itself unable to organize its own finances. The pound that had governed global commerce became just another currency, its value determined by speculation rather than substance. Britain emerged from the Second World War victorious but broke, with an empire it could no longer afford to administer, and a currency no one any longer trusted as the foundation of the international system. The mantle passed to America not through conquest, but through economic inevitability. And with it passed the pattern that neither Rome nor Britain had managed to escape. America inherited the British system and promised to perfect it. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 reorganized the global economy around the dollar, backed by gold, with all other currencies linked to the dollar at fixed rates. This was supposed to create stability, to prevent the competitive devaluations and trade wars that had characterized the interwar period. For nearly 3 decades, the system worked brilliantly. The American economy dominated global production. European nations and Japan, rebuilt with American assistance, bought American goods with dollars earned through trade. The dollar's link to gold created confidence that this wasn't just American currency. It was an objective store of value. America could print dollars knowing that other nations would accept them because those dollars could be exchanged for gold at $35 per ounce. This arrangement gave the United States an extraordinary privilege. They could run trade deficits, fund overseas military commitments, finance domestic programs, all by creating more dollars, because global demand for dollars exceeded the supply. Other nations needed dollars to buy oil, to engage in international trade, to hold as reserves. But the pattern was already asserting itself, invisible to those managing the system. The number of dollars in circulation gradually exceeded the amount of gold backing them. At first, the discrepancy was small, manageable. But as American expenses increased, fighting wars in Korea and Vietnam, funding the space race, building the interstate highway system, expanding social programs, the gap widened. Foreign governments began to notice. The French, under de Gaulle, explicitly called out the arrangement as allowing America to tax the world through inflation. They began exchanging dollars for gold. Other nations watched and calculated. By 1971, the mathematics had become impossible. The United States held about 10,000 tons of gold. Foreign governments held claims on more than 3 times that amount. If even a fraction of those claims were presented for redemption, American gold reserves would vanish. President Nixon faced the same choice every empire faces when prosperity exceeds production. He could accept dramatic austerity, slashing government spending, accepting recession, maintaining the dollar's link to gold, but at devastating economic cost. Or he could break the link, maintain the spending, and hope confidence would persist without the physical backing. On August 15, 1971, Nixon announced the temporary suspension of dollar convertibility to gold. Like Rome's debasement, like Britain's abandonment of the gold standard, the temporary measure became permanent. The dollar remained the global reserve currency, not because it was backed by gold, but because there was no alternative, because the entire architecture of international trade and finance was denominated in dollars, because changing the system would be more disruptive than maintaining the fiction. What happened next demonstrates the pattern's most sophisticated evolution. In previous eras, the substitution of symbols for substance was obvious. Roman coins contained less silver. You could test them, weigh them, see the debasement. But modern fiat currency is pure abstraction. A dollar is worth a dollar because we agree it is, because the system functions on collective belief rather than physical constraint. This arrangement has allowed prosperity to continue longer than would have been possible under a gold standard. The American economy has created genuine innovation, real technological advancement, improvements in living standards that would have been impossible with fixed money supply. But the pattern's mathematics remain inescapable. Without physical constraint, the temptation to print becomes irresistible. Every crisis is met with monetary expansion. Every recession is fought with newly created currency. The government deficit, which in a gold-backed system would have imposed automatic limits, instead grows without apparent constraint. We no longer mint coins with less silver. We no longer even print paper notes for most transactions. We print belief, adding zeros to digital ledgers and trusting that confidence will persist, that the system will continue functioning because it has always functioned, because we cannot imagine the alternative. The national debt has exceeded $34 trillion, a number so large it loses meaning. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has expanded from under $1 trillion in 2008 to over $8 trillion today. Real wages, adjusted for actual inflation in housing, education, and healthcare, have stagnated for decades. But the stock market reaches new highs, asset prices inflate, and we tell ourselves this is prosperity rather than the same pattern that has destroyed every empire that believed itself immune to history's mathematics. And belief, like empires, eventually runs out. Place them side by side on a timeline. Rome from republic to collapse, Britain from ascendance to decline, America from Bretton Woods to the present moment. The pattern emerges with crystalline clarity. First comes the phase of genuine creation. Rome conquering and organizing, Britain industrializing and innovating, America producing and rebuilding. Real wealth generated through actual productivity. Then comes expansion, where success creates confidence, confidence enables leverage, and leverage accelerates apparent prosperity. Rome extending citizenship, Britain establishing global trade networks, America denominating the world in dollars. Next arrives complacency, where abundance creates entitlement, where populations begin to believe prosperity is natural rather than earned, permanent rather than conditional. Roman citizens demanding grain doles, British workers striking despite global competition, American consumers living beyond means sustained by credit. Then comes the substitution, where maintaining prosperity through production becomes impossible, so prosperity is maintained through monetary manipulation instead. Debasing denarii, abandoning gold standards, printing digital currency. Each generation convinced their situation is unique, their technology sufficient to transcend the pattern. Finally comes the reckoning. Not sudden, not dramatic, but gradual erosion until one day the accumulated consequences can no longer be ignored. Borders that cannot be defended, currencies no one trusts, populations that cannot be fed through domestic production. Systems too complex to maintain. The empire doesn't fall. It dissolves slowly into something smaller, poorer, less significant than what it once was. The pattern has executed with mechanical precision through every iteration because it's not really about economics. It's about human nature. Prosperity creates the psychological conditions for decline. Abundance teaches the wrong lessons. When life is easy, people forget that ease must be earned. When money flows freely, people forget that value must be created. When systems function automatically, people forget that systems require maintenance. The economic mechanisms, currency debasement, deficit spending, asset bubbles, these are just the visible symptoms of a deeper transformation in collective psychology. The pattern is mathematical, but the mathematics operate on human behavior. Here is the insight that should terrify anyone paying attention. We are currently in the fourth phase, substitution fully operational, reckoning approaching. The United States has been running this playbook for over 50 years. The consequences haven't manifested in obvious collapse because the dollar remains the global reserve currency, because there is no alternative system ready to replace it, because the entire world is invested in maintaining the fiction. But the constraints are tightening. The debt grows faster than the economy. The currency loses purchasing power despite official statistics claiming inflation is controlled. Asset prices divorce from underlying productivity. Geopolitical competitors develop alternative systems. Younger generations look at housing prices, education costs, healthcare expenses, and reasonably conclude the prosperity their grandparents enjoyed is no longer accessible. The pattern doesn't care about your political affiliation. It doesn't matter if you believe in free markets or government intervention, if you vote left or right, if you trust institutions, or consider yourself a skeptic. The mathematics operate regardless. You cannot consume more than you produce indefinitely. You cannot substitute belief for value permanently. You cannot escape consequences simply because those consequences are delayed. Rome believed their civilization would last forever because it had already lasted centuries. Britain believed their empire would endure because it spanned the globe. America believes the dollar system will continue because it has persisted for generations. Every empire believes it has transcended the pattern, right up until the moment when the pattern completes its equation. Prosperity without discipline is a countdown disguised as progress. The timer started the moment Nixon closed the gold window. It accelerated with each successive crisis, met with monetary expansion rather than structural reform. It compounds with every year where consumption exceeds production, where debt grows faster than wealth, where symbols are mistaken for substance. Understanding the pattern doesn't guarantee escape. Rome had historians who documented previous empires. Britain had economists who studied Rome. America has access to all of recorded history. Knowledge provides no immunity because the political incentives always favor continuation over correction. No elected official campaigns on austerity. No central banker achieves fame by constraining the money supply. No population votes for lower living standards even when those living standards are unsustainable. The pattern persists not through ignorance, but through the rational response of individuals to perverse incentives. But understanding does provide something valuable: the ability to see what's actually happening while there's still time to make individual preparations, to distinguish between genuine wealth and financial illusion, to recognize that systems which cannot continue will not continue regardless of how many experts insist otherwise. The pattern has never failed. Through every iteration, across every civilization, the sequence has completed with mechanical inevitability. And the next chapter, the phase where accumulated imbalances overwhelm the system's ability to maintain coherence, where belief finally exhausts itself, where reality reasserts its primacy over human preference, that chapter has already begun. You're watching it unfold in real time, in the mathematics of unpayable debts and the politics of impossible promises, in the gap between asset prices and actual productivity, in the growing awareness that something fundamental has broken even if most people can't articulate exactly what. The pattern is old, older than economics, older than currency, as old as human civilization itself. And it's happening again.